Welcome everyone to another video, and in this video I am going to be joined with Paul from Reddit. He posts on the Silpharina Reddit the weekly metas for each cup and for regionals, and so I'm really excited to have him join our discussion, join the channel to talk about how what surprises or and potential insights he has around the week one meta to help you with your future cups. So enough of me blabbering and talking. Let's actually go over to the Reddit discussion and go over to Paul to have him introduce themselves. And I have a list of questions to get some really good insights from him. Now we have Paul joining us. Paul, why don't you introduce yourself?
All right. My name is Paul. In-game name is Hornfeld, and my Reddit name is Flood Ate My Neighbor.
All right, perfect. Why don't you tell us where you play out of, how long you've been playing Pogo, and how PvP has changed your gameplay?
Sure. So originally from Richmond, Virginia, transplant to Long Island near New York City, for those who don't know. I've been playing since day one. The within minutes of the app coming out, my roommate and I were running around, wasting all of our Pokeballs on Zubats in the streets that night. So yeah, I've been doing this a little bit. In terms of PvP, originally I wasn't that interested in it until the cup started coming around, and really beginning with Boulder Cup, I was like, okay, I've found my Pokemon Go calling and have really shifted my entire play style towards optimizing PvP.
Perfect. And I find personally for myself, one of the ways that I optimize my PvP gameplay is I go to the Silpharina Reddit, and one of my favorite weekly posts are about the meta for the cup or for regionals. So I've been reading and following them, and I thought, well, why not? It's a good opportunity to have you come on the channel and recap what the meta is. But before we go into the recap, why don't you tell us the history behind it, like how you got started, who you work with?
Sure. So, really, the idea started with the Boulder Cup. Basically, I decided I wanted to win Boulder Cup, didn't know how I was going to do it, and Reddit did not fail me. And so, I heard about the double or triple Skarmory idea from Reddit, which I was not a Reddit user prior to that at all. Basically, when Twilight came around, I wanted to give back. So I pulled as much data from as many cups as I could. I made posts asking for cup results, and then I just analyzed them by raw brute force. No formulas, no algorithms, just looking through patterns in numerical lists. But eventually, I noticed that Arcos00 was doing some very interesting things with the spreadsheets, but really just kind of was throwing his spreadsheet on Reddit and then not giving much exposition about it. So I messaged him about potentially partnering up. And we've been doing that for a couple of months now, and it's working very well. And we're really excited because we finally come together and created a template that he feels satisfied like releasing publicly. And so that's actually going to happen tomorrow.
Oh, exciting.
So everyone will be able to see the spreadsheet that we're pulling the information from.
All right, perfect. And then, so you talked about, my next question is about how you collect the data, but it sounds like you've covered that. My question is, in your post, you talk about various metrics, and tell me about what metrics you use, and why you feel that they are important.
So, what I will talk mostly about is what we're going to have moving forward. Um, the biggest thing that I talk about is something called overperformance. And essentially, what that means is, if you think about it, if everything were equally good and it didn't really matter what you were using, if 50% of people were using a particular Pokemon, then 50% of winners should also be using that particular Pokemon. Um, but if 50% of users are players are using that one, but 70% of winners have it, then it is overperforming by 20% or 20 points. So that is the metric that is one of the main ones that we look at in terms of not just analyzing what is most popular, but what might be essentially be undervalued amongst whether it's general users or specific users. So what we're going to have moving forward is basically 3 different categories of overperformers. So the first one, and this is going to be brand new, is what we're calling diamond in the rough. So this is going to be where we take a look at purely the number of times it's used versus the number of times it wins. So that's really useful for something that has been used maybe only 4 times, but has won once or twice, despite being used so infrequently. That might be a strong indication that it's a diamond in the rough.
Yeah, absolutely.
Next would be just a general performance over performers. So that's going to be just comparing every player, regardless of skill level, rank, anything, compared to winning rosters. And then the other one, which is going to be brand new as well, is elite over performance. And that is going to be basically just looking at the rosters of challengers and aces, and comparing what winners are using to what those rosters have.
Oh,
and that
interesting.
provides us a whole nother level of interesting information.
All right, perfect. No, I look forward to seeing those metrics and what falls in each category. Do you have an example of a diamond in the rough that you've seen in a previous cup or in the current
Yeah.
cup?
So the one that is currently topping our list with a grand total of 4 uses and 1 win is Gloom.
Gloom. Yeah.
Gloom has not been talked about at all, from what I understand. But 4 people have used it, and 1.
I think that winner was in my Philly Cup.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah,
tied for first, right?
yeah. So
And he actually used Gloom, so in
right,
his lineup. So
yeah. So one of those grass type alternatives, and this diamond in the rough doesn't necessarily indicate that it's better than anything else, but it's certainly worth considering and worth
absolutely,
trying out. Yeah,
for sure. I think there's like definitely for people that run like off meta picks, there's certainly the surprise factor
right.
that people have a difficult time dealing with. So that makes total sense. So I'm looking forward to the changes and updates, and as well look forward to closely following your weekly posts. So the next thing I want to talk about is the Rainbow Cup meta. So for me, the Rainbow Cup meta is probably the most interesting meta that I've come across, in the sense that personally, I did a very early cup tournament, so I always feel like a little bit more uncomfortable with the tournament than I do later in the month. But I do that on purpose so people can get a feel of the flow of the tournament in the meta. But for me, even there's so many different Pokemon that the night before I was practicing against one person, and I'm like, oh man, this person's exploiting this giant hole in my team every single time, and
Mhm.
I don't have an answer for it. So I changed my lineup, battle another top ranked player, and then I'm like, oh man, this person's also exploiting a weakness in my team. So I felt like this is probably the most uncomfortable I felt going in the tournament. So I consider the meta pretty wide open. But why don't
Yeah.
you give me an overall summary, high level summary of the week one meta for Rainbow Cup?
Yeah. So, in terms of the week one meta compared to other week one metas, the usage percentage of the top users or top mons is way lower than what we've seen in previous cups. The most used overall is only in 57.5% of rosters versus in previous cups, you're seeing Toxicroak being used in 70 to 80% of rosters at a minimum.
Oh wow.
Um, so there's a significant amount more variety than before. Um, but to contrast that, in terms of roster performance, we actually see a pretty significant break. So when you're comparing um, winning rosters to non-winning rosters, there's actually a fairly clear formula, which is pretty straightforward. It's a fire, a grass, a quagsire, a fortress, a Azumarill or Mantine, or perhaps some other water Pokemon, and then an electric type. Um, so yeah, that's very consistently that's what the top players or the winning players seem to be using.
Okay, perfect. And so you talk about Quagsire, obviously that's probably one of the most commonly used Pokemon. How about in terms of fire Pokemon? Which one do you it
Yeah,
was the most
so
used, strongest performer, and then underperformers?
Yeah, so my most recent post, I'm catching all kinds of flack for bashing Ninetales. I think some people feel personally offended. um, but at the end of the day, the metrics behind Charizard are crazy good. It is the most used Pokemon in the tournament
Hmm.
so far, edging out Venusaur and then slightly edging out Quagsire above that. But in terms of winning percentage, it's still at the top
Oh,
of winning percentage and even spreads that gap a little bit more. So it's used 1.5% more than Venusaur, but it wins 4.3% more than Venusaur. Um, also, in terms of that general overperformance that I was talking about earlier, it's coming in at 19%. So 19% more winning teams are using it over general teams,
oh wow.
right? Um, and so there could be multiple explanations for that, except when you look at underperformers, Ninetales is ranking up pretty high on the underperformers with a negative 8.5, which means that let me go back to my where is it right here? So Ninetales is being used. Um, um, let's see here. I think I'm looking at the wrong thing over here. Okay, so Ninetales is being used on about 9% of rosters, but the number of winning rosters that have Ninetales is it's not even on the top 25. It's less than 2%
Oh
of
wow.
of winning rosters. Um, so yeah, the numbers are looking really bad for Ninetales. There are other possible explanations. Perhaps um, um, perhaps it has to do with baiting out your opponent into using electric types. Maybe it has to do with maybe Legacy Ninetales is required
Yeah,
for
absolutely.
Ninetales to be good, or maybe it's a trap, and maybe Legacy Ninetales with Psyshock is actually the problem, and maybe you need Solar Beam for it to be good. The data is not going to tell me that.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. For right
um,
now, but that's some interesting insights around fire users. I expected Charizard to be very common. I ran Charizard on my team, but to be honest, I flipped back and forth on whether to use Charizard or Ninetales or actually using Mantine to take care of grass Pokemon. In terms of a water Pokemon, I know there's the water is probably the most interesting part of the meta because there are so many different
yeah,
types of water Pokemon, like in terms of dual types, and they have a huge range of purposes.
right.
But which of the water Pokemon were used most frequently, overperformed, and underperformed?
So Quagsire, it was the third most common Pokemon overall, third most common on winning rosters, and has a really solid overperformance score, right behind Charizard's. Um, um, so Quagsire is pretty much a must. Um, um, Next most common and having actually the highest overperformance rate is Azumarill. Um, it's on just over a third of people's rosters, um, but it's on over half of winners' rosters. Um, um, which I find really surprising. Right behind Azumarill, we have Mantine, boasting solid numbers, but just not as good as Azumarill's. Its over performance score is not as high, um, um, which is very surprising to me because Mantine looks great. It looks better than Azumarill on paper. Um, um, and I feel like unless you see some footage of Azumarill, you know, rosters with Azumarill versus rosters with Mantine, you're not gonna. I have no idea exactly what it
Yeah,
is.
yeah, no, for sure. For me, I know that early on in the meta discussion, when I was talking to a lot of top ranked players, they
Mm-hmm.
were not that high on Azumarill.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, it was a
Yeah.
comfortable pick for my own roster to use because I felt like it's very bulky, has like pretty wide range of moves. But I also see
Mm-hmm.
Mantine also maybe being a little bit more difficult of a Pokemon to use because
Yeah.
some of its wins are a little bit harder to gauge. Like for example, it does beat the grass Pokemon, but you do get hit very hard against Venusaur. So there might be you have to like really understand the shielding matchups and what happens when you switch in and when do you need to
Right.
shield or not shield, and it can be when what moves you should be using versus maybe Azumarill has like a little bit more straightforward of a usage, and as well people are very comfortable
Yeah.
with it. So that's interesting. How about for grass? Which ones were the most used? Outperformed, underperformed?
Yeah, so Venusaur was quite dominant again, second across the board, fourth best over performance score. Um, really, really dominating the competition. Um, Meganium had one of the worst underperformance scores with a negative 10.5%, which is the fourth worst. Just to kind of quickly go through the underperformers overall, Raikou was the biggest underperformer, then Blastoise, then Lapras, then Meganium, and then Ninetales.
Oh, wow, okay.
Um, So yeah, the value of the earthquake it's just it doesn't help that much with coverage, I think.
Yeah,
Uh,
no, absolutely.
um,
Especially on the switch in to Charizard, like
yeah,
at least with Venusaur, if they're too slow to switch, there's the opportunity to get to two Sludge Bombs, which is going to do a lot of damage, especially if they want to try to farm some energy on off the Venusaur. Versus Earthquake, Earthquake just doesn't do as much damage to Charizard as Sludge Bomb, and it might be a different story if people were running more Ninetales,
exactly.
right?
Yep.
Where Psyshock would do a lot of damage to Venusaur, and that's all you need to do to KO it. Versus it's going to only do neutral damage to Meganium. So as long as
Right.
I think obviously the metas are going to be influenced on what's used commonly in other parts of the meta. So I'll be interested in seeing. At least I'm watching closely the uses of grass Pokemon. Mostly because of this next bucket. I'm not sure if you've bucketed this one out around confusion users
Right.
and confusion users having, at least for me, I didn't run Venusaur mostly because I wanted to catch people with my Executor. But
Yeah.
tell me like what your thoughts were on around confusion users in this meta so far. Which one do you think was most favorable to use?
Yeah. So the confusion users as a separate role does not seem to be a winning formula. Slowbro, Slow King, none of them made top 10
Mhm.
in anything really. Um, so going out of your way to fill one of your water slots with one of the confusion users does not seem to work that great. However, confusion executor looks quite great. It's Give me a second. I need to pull up the data. So we've entered some more data since the stuff came out from the cups that were completed yesterday
Mhm.
and today. And so Executor is no longer showing up on the overperformance list for general overperformance like it was earlier, but it is the fourth best and the diamond in the rough list. Um, it is, especially if you don't have Legacy Venusaur and you do have Legacy Executor, is definitely worth considering making it your grass type.
Yeah, so some because I heard a lot of hype around very early on around the water confusion users, Slowpoke, Slowbro, but they seem to be underperforming in week one meta, and they're difficult Pokemon to use. Confusion users, some people ask me whether or not I should run Venusaur, Meganium, or should run Executor Execute. I generally tell them that Venusaur and Meganium are a little bit easier and a little bit more straightforward to use versus these confusion users. You have to like really understand like how long of a move confusion is, and if you
Mm-hmm.
do one too many confusions, that can basically cost you from getting off the charge move in time, or not. Versus like when you're doing Vine Whip or Razor Leaf, it's a totally different
Right.
story. So it can be tricky. Like if you do a confusion and they switch out at the beginning of your confusion, then you're going to be destroyed by these bug bites that are going to be coming from the fortress. So
Yeah.
certainly a challenging one to use. Electrics, I know you already talked about the major underperformer, which is Raikou.
Yeah.
How about for the ones that overperformed, that performed well?
Yeah, so Raichu looks quite good. It is the fifth most commonly used Pokemon overall, um, and it's on more winning teams, more winning rosters than any of the other electrics. 42.6% of them. Um, um, Comparing Raichu, though, so Raichu's overperformance score is not that great comparatively. It's only at a 6.6. Um, so Lantern is showing up as well. Now Lantern was showing up with a higher overperformance score earlier. It's now below Raichu, which typically means that Raichu is the clear favorite.
Yeah.
Um, and I actually attribute that to Magneton. Um, um, Enough people went out of their way, like previously, to get legacy Magnetons, and they're trying to get their mileage out of it. And Raichu just annihilates legacy Magneton in the mirror. Um, um, so I think that's what's going on there. I guess we can talk later on about where the meta is headed.
Yeah, because especially since you've collected a little bit of data, and I'm sure people are making adjustments to their roster as they read up on these reports and start to get a better feel of that. And the last category I want to cover in terms of the current meta are the bug users or the bug
Yeah.
Pokemon.
So again, Fortress was dominant, surprisingly dominant. It's used more than twice as often as Beedrill, and it wins 3 times as often as Beedrill. So yeah, it's and really I think that fact, that and Azumarill, I think have has the biggest impact on the meta and the top choices right now. Um, um, so yeah.
Yeah, no, I was interesting. I did expect Fortress to be the most common one, just because it does wall the grass Pokemon very well. Does very well against Executor and Execute, and does very well. But I'm actually surprised that it relative to its usage is actually better than Beedrill, because I think with Beedrill, like if you're a pretty skilled user, it does lose to these other bug Pokemon, but does pick up a lot of the matchups in water, especially against Azumarill, but does very well against the water Pokemon, where Fortress doesn't do quite as well, or has at best like slightly negative matchups against it. So that's interesting to see. I'm gonna closely follow that part of the meta as well, but it doesn't seem like there's too many choices. Well, besides I guess Venomoth, but
Right.
actually, can you speak a little bit about Venomoth and its use? Because like it could be a confusion user, could be act as more
Right.
of a bug Pokemon depending on what fast move people have on it. But
Yeah.
as a
So
generally,
Venomoth's stats aren't terrible, but they're not good either. It's just overshadowed by the performance of Fortress.
yeah, absolutely.
There's no indicator. Just looking at the math, that would suggest that you should really strongly consider Venomoth over Fortress, or any other bug type for that matter.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think potentially because Fortress is extremely weak to fire, but because the fire Pokemon also have to deal with grass, that when it comes down to when Fortress comes in, there might not be a counter available to it, which might attribute to why it's doing quite well. So it doesn't necessarily even have to hide as well, because it can just hide behind when a Venusaur comes out and the Charizard comes out, then the appropriate counter to it. So, and yeah, plus like its move pool is quite interesting for it. So the last part I wanna cover before you can do any shoutouts or is predictions on the meta. Like, what do you think people will continue to use? What do you think people will stop using? And and adjust to the week one meta?
Yeah. So the biggest thing I'm really curious about is if Azumarill is going to continue to be there. What I think the data is showing more than anything else is that comfort and familiarity might be beginning to win out over like optimal choices.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's the best explanation I can find for what we're seeing currently in week one, with Charizard, Venusaur, Quagsire, and Azumarill doing so well, and Raichu for that matter, Lantern as well. Um, um, that's it it's the best explanation that I have. And I think that might continue into the future as well. So we may be getting to a point in PvP where your best choices are going to be that which you have the most practice with, assuming that you have your bases covered.
Absolutely.
And there's not going to be so much of a need to explore, find the right Pokemon that can handle 101 different situations. But really, being able to feel confident in operating your Pokemon, and that way you can focus on what your opponent is doing and countering their moves.
And I think that's a very important observation. I can think like practice does make perfect and allow you to be more comfortable and understand when to use the right charge move, when to switch in, and when how to play it properly. And that might not even come in your practice for this particular cup. It might be from previous matchups that you've had and that you feel comfortable and confident with using. So you think that familiarity is going to continue? What Pokemon do you think people will, based off your predictions and some of the data that you have and your thoughts on how meta changes? What are some Pokemon that you think people will stop using or use a lower percentage?
So, I it's really difficult to predict with this because I feel like what I'm seeing in the numbers, the meta is usually a little bit more settled by this point in time than it is, or than it currently is. I think we're normally there's a pre-cup meta,
Yeah.
and then there's a progression over time. I think that the meta settled within the first weekend, which is later than it usually does. Um, um, so the biggest things that I'm most curious about is Azumarill, whether Azumarill is going to continue to be as prevalent, or if people are going to start switching over to Mantine. And if that's the case, I think that that Kingdra some space could actually be opened up for Kingdra to start doing better.
And certainly,
But if Azumarill I'm sorry, go ahead.
oh yeah, certainly one of the main reasons I brought Azumarill as well is that more so for my earlier matchups, I actually expected people to run Kingdra more. So that was just like for me to have a wall to farm up Kingdra. But actually, I saw very few instances of people that ran Kingdra against me.
Yep. Um, um, Outside of that, though, I am not expecting too much to change. Usually there's little slight shifts that occur over time. But I really think that Charizard is going to continue its dominance. Because Fortress is so dominant, I think Typhlosion had a chance. But I think Fortress use is just going to continue to expand, and that's just going to improve Charizard's performance even further. Um, the I and Confusion Executor would have the possibility of changing things a little bit more if it wasn't Legacy.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
As you got that barrier
Yeah,
that's gonna
absolutely.
help keep the meta a little bit more stable around the grass picks and then countering those picks. Those are I think that's going to stay quite stable the way it is right now with Venusaur dominant, an Executor as a viable alternative that you should be prepared for if you're trying to sweep your cup.
Perfect. So you're looking at Charizard, Venusaur, Quagsire, Fortress, a Water Flex pick, might be Azumarill, might be Mantine. We might see some more Kingdra depending on how the use of Azumarill is using, and then you're seeing an electric type, generally
Yeah,
Raichu, a little
Raichu
bit.
or Lantern. And I'll give a quick shout out to Electrode as well.
Ooh, okay, all right.
Yeah, it's diamond. It has the second highest diamond in the rough score, um, um, and has had some interesting use to the point where like today, I was around asking everybody in my community if they have extra Voltorbs.
No,
Um, I'm planning to try it out just because you know uh, it, to take a look at its matchups. It wins a surprising number of the electric
oh
matchups,
wow, okay.
and several rosters have had good success with it. It's been on 6.4% of winning rosters. Um, 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 and I can't. It doesn't. It's not even on the top 30 of rosters used overall. So
Oh wow,
I couldn't even tell you. It's somewhere less than 4% of players using it overall. Um,
perfect.
so
That sounds great. I look forward to seeing your recaps on a weekly basis. But I'm also looking forward to the bigger picture psychology around metas and how long they take to settle. As you observe that usually they settle before even the first weekend, and but for this one it took until after the weekend to actually see it settle and to continue that trend. So I look forward to seeing some of the meta discussions that you'll have in the future. So thank you very much, Paul, for the recap and for the discussion. I look forward to all the changes and adjustments and analysis that you'll be doing going forward.
thank you.
All right,
Take care.
all right, take care.
Bye.
And again, if you guys like this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And I'll see everyone in the next video.